Hello and welcome to MEE Live. I'm Mohammed Hashim. It's Tuesday, the 5th of May, 2026. Now, why is Keir Starmer seemingly so committed to banning protests that call out Israel's war crimes? Now, last week, two Jewish men, aged 34 and 76, were stabbed in Golders Green, a neighborhood of northwest London with a large Jewish population. The attacker, Essa Suleiman, is also accused of attempting to murder a third person for stabbing a Muslim man whom he had known earlier that day. Suleiman, who was released from a psychiatric hospital just days before the attacks, had been charged not with terrorism offenses, but with 3 counts of attempted murder and 1 count of possession of a bladed article in a public place. Now, a few important things to note here. Shortly after the attack, UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer had this to say.
If you stand alongside people who say globalize the intifada, you are calling for terrorism against Jews. And people who use that phrase should be prosecuted.
Now, this led to accusations against Starmer of weaponizing anti-Semitism. Critics are also pointing out how a Tommy Robinson-led far-right march planned for the same day as the May 16th Nakba Day demonstration has received almost none of the same outrage, despite Islamophobic chants like calling for the ban of Islam being heard in previous protests.
So ban Judaism would be okay?
So what we're saying, I think you're going into hypotheticals. What about this? What about that? We've seen what's happened. What we've seen happen in this country is it become normalised that it is essentially okay to call for the end of Israel, and we don't agree with that.
Lots of Muslims think that hatred against them has become normalised.
And it's this double standard, which is what we'll explore with today's guest. And are these horrific attacks being weaponized to shut down the right of protest in the UK? Joining me now is James Schneider. He's the communications director of Progressive International. Previously, he was the director of communications under Jeremy Corbyn and a Jewish activist himself. James, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely.
Nice to be with you.
Absolutely. James, I want to start off. What does weaponizing anti-Semitism look like to you?
I think it means taking Jewish fear and Jewish pain and using it for political purposes that the state is setting up that are to their benefit. So that means mobilizing understandable fear and worry that many Jewish people have. I mean, there have been a number of attacks in a pretty small area of northwest London over recent weeks, and instead focusing on what should be done to keep people safe. It is instead using it for a political purpose, which is to try to shut down protest and opposition to the British state support for Israel's crimes against the Palestinians.
And do you believe that it's playing out in the UK in this context?
Yeah, I think clearly that is what we're seeing. People in the political media class have leapt on the opportunity to pin the blame for anti-Semitic violence on those that support the rights of Palestinians. They've been doing this same thing now for 2.5 years, trying to label peace marches as hate marches. It's the world turned upside down. And so it's unsurprising that that's what we're seeing carry out here again.
And as I was saying in the intro, the attacker is charged with 3 counts of attempted murder, 2 Jewish victims, and a third who is a Muslim. That received very little attention. I just wanted to get your thoughts on this particular aspect.
So the third victim became known later on, and the reporting requirements sort of kick in once a charge has been made. I mean, clearly more should be made of the fact that this is a clearly very mentally unwell person with a penchant for violence earlier on in the day. But you also shouldn't erase the fact that if someone specifically comes to a very Jewish area and specifically attacks 2 visibly Jewish people, it's completely right to view that as anti-Semitic violence and something which should be treated as anti-Semitic violence. That said, you also have to look at the fact that you have a mentally unwell person who appears to, allegedly, put in allegedly everywhere that you need to for legal reasons, but it looks like allegedly has big interest in violence. It's been reported that he stabbed a police officer almost 20 years ago 9 times. And again, this sort of thing is what should be the focus. If you want to keep people safe, that's the sort of thing that you should be looking at, not trying to police the language of protesters about a completely different issue.
And how do you react to, I guess, Keir Starmer and the government's reactions to it, including the recently announced Downing Street Anti-Semitism Summit?
So it's mixed. Some of it is good and some of it is very bad. I mean, the good stuff is getting more money to protect Jewish institutions. I think when institutions from a particular religious group are under attack, schools, churches, mosques, synagogues, temples, whatever they might be, they should be protected, and people should feel, all religious groups, but particularly religious minorities, should feel safe in their own country. All of that stuff is good and is what should be focused on. The attempt to turn this into a political weapon to bash those that are opposed, let's call it what it is. They're opposed to British state policy. It has been British state policy to support the genocide of the Palestinian people by the Israeli state through diplomatic cover, the selling of arms, and the offering of intelligence. So it's quite right that people have been protesting against that and calling that out, including a lot of Jewish people. There are lots of Jewish people. There's organised Jewish bloc on each of these 35 national marches that there have been since October 2023. And in an attempt to basically silence political debate that you don't like from the pulpit of the state is obviously the wrong thing to do. It's not just the wrong thing to do because it's morally wrong. It's not just the wrong thing to do because it creates a kind of hierarchy of racism. It's not just wrong because it's if you follow the logic down, it is a form of anti-Palestinian racism. It's not just wrong because it ties Britain more tightly into the crimes of a foreign state. But it will also, I think, further drive anti-Semitism. If you create the idea that the Jews here and Jewish safety here is related to support for crimes of a foreign state, the state of Israel, which commits an unbelievable litany of crimes against other people, then you are pushing the anti-Semitic idea that Jews and Israel can be conflated. Now, of course, the Israeli state does that. Benjamin Netanyahu does that. And it is extremely dangerous. It means that more people will see Jews and Israel as being the same thing when, of course, we're not.
Well, just on that note, James, because it takes me to my follow-up question, what do you think the impact of what's playing out right now is going to be on just the tightening space around pro-Palestinian demonstrations and pro-Palestinian solidarity in this country?
Well, they will be used to reduce what people can say and what people can do. I mean, there's been an effort to do that for a long time, and it gets pushed back. I mean, for example, part of the reason why terrorists, counter-terror police are a bit overstretched is there's an epidemic of terrorism arrests taking place in this country, just not an epidemic of terrorism. 2,700 peaceful protesters have been arrested for holding up a sign with 7 words on it, which shows solidarity with Palestinians facing genocide. This will carry on happening because the overwhelming majority of British people, if you look at the polling, don't support British state policy, which is to support grave crimes against the Palestinian people. Now, they will use whatever mechanisms that they can to render that kind of protest illegitimate by definition. And the thing that I think is particularly dangerous for Jewish people in that is it aligns supposedly collective Jewry with the political positions of the British state and with the Israeli state, which are positions which should rightly be opposed, and in opposing them, that is no threat to Jews as Jews at all.
And actually, speaking of that, we have a clip for Zach Polanski that we're going to prep in a second, and it's something that I wanted to get your reaction on. It's part of the media's response, or the criticism towards the media's response. And Zach Polanski was interviewed recently, and critics said that he was basically treated with contempt for defending the right to protest. But let's get your reaction to it.
As a Jewish person, I march with many Jewish people on those marches. Now, there are already laws to deal with.
But you're not all Jews. I'm just saying that currently the policy is...
But why is my Jewish identity being erased from this conversation?
No, I'm not erasing it.
So many people on those marches.
Don't try that one on me.
So what's the problem here, James? How do you react to this?
Trevor Phillips is an establishment figure, close friend of Peter Mandelson's, right at the heart of the British political media class. So it's totally unsurprising that he would be scathing, dismissive and oppositional to Zach Polanski, or indeed anybody on the left of British politics who is trying to advance an entirely different set of relations for Britain here at home, within our economy and our politics and our relationship with the world, including our support for the grave crimes of our allies, the United States and Israel.
Mm-hmm. My last question before I let you go, James, I'm running out of time, but this is something that I'm curious to get your thoughts on, because there's a persistent argument here that I feel is also playing out, that the British left is reluctant to confront anti-Semitism. And I use that in quotes in terms of reluctant. But how do you react to that argument?
Well, I mean, there are sections of the British left that are reluctant to deal with anti-Semitism, which does exist. It is small. It exists less in the left, and if you look at polling, it exists less in Green voters than in other voters. But it is, of course, a real thing. But if you want people to take it seriously, endlessly weaponizing it against them, coming up with bogus claims, claiming that Zach Polanski, a Jewish political leader, is driving anti-Semitism because he opposes the slaughter of Palestinian people, is no way to get people to take it seriously. We've had in this country now for more than a decade a moral panic about anti-Semitism on the left and within the pro-Palestinian movement, and it is doing nothing to reduce actually existing anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is a real thing in British society, and I think it is getting worse. You can judge that by the reported cases of it getting worse. Of course, there's been a spate of violence recently, or more anecdotally, the amount of stuff I can judge in getting in my sort of social media mentions, which predominantly come from the right. It's predominantly kind of great replacement theory stuff, which says that Jews are trying to replace white people with Muslims, and the reason why I'm supposedly pro-Palestinian and pro-refugee and so on is because I'm a Jew trying to replace white people. It is a real thing, and it should be taken seriously. It doesn't mean it's the most significant form of racism in British society. It clearly isn't, but it is a real thing that people should pay attention to. But that doesn't mean that you accept nonsense. It doesn't mean that you accept weaponization. Those things have to be called out. Absolutely. And I think we need to be able to do all three things together. We need to recognize and condemn anti-Semitism where it is and educate against it. We need to call out and oppose its weaponization for political purposes. And we need to call out how the claims of anti-Semitism are used by the state of Israel and its supporters in order to support their campaign of erasing Palestinians.
And we'll leave it here. James Schneider, thank you so much for coming on MEE Live.
Thanks for having me.
Now over to my second guest, Em Hilton, who is a Jewish organizer and writer based in London, and she's the co-founder of Neighbourhood, UK Jews Against Israeli Occupation and Apartheid. Em, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. It's good to see you. Em, you recently wrote that there is, quote, no competition between Jewish safety and Palestinian freedom. Can you explain that for me?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what we are seeing particularly in UK political discourse and also in the response to the horrific anti-Semitic crimes that have taken place in the last few months is that, either if you have to support Jewish people and Jewish safety and tackle anti-Semitism, or you can only support Palestine and Palestinian freedom and solidarity. And I think what a lot of my organizing and writing and the work that we've done to set up Nahmod and also within in setting up the Jewish bloc on the marches is to show that these two things are not in competition. They're actually interconnected. And so in order for us to be able to have and fight for a world in which all people can thrive and live safely wherever they are, we need to stop creating this competition, and we need to, that politicians particularly, to not be instrumentalizing the real fear and concerns that many Jewish people have about the state of the UK right now in order to silence and restrict Palestine protests as well.
Well, speaking of politicians, you have been on the ground at these marches. I want to ask you about your personal experience and how it, I guess, how it plays out compared to how the media and many of these politicians are basically describing it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, having been part of the Jewish bloc, I can say that I have felt it was a necessary moral duty to go on these marches, particularly as Israel has wrought so much genocidal destruction on Gaza, and that we had an obligation to speak out. And I think what you can see from those marches is how so many other Jewish people feel the same way. And it was really important to show up, and that actually there was a lot of solidarity on those marches. And, I know that there have been some problematic signs and problematic people who join those marches. And I think that, that has to be addressed. Like we can't dismiss that. And actually, I think people who channel their pro-Palestinian sentiment through anti-Semitic ideas or whatever are not acceptable or isn't acceptable. But I think that in many ways, there has also been a targeted campaign against these marches by saying that they are inherently fueled by anti-Semitism, which is very dangerous, because what you're essentially saying is people who are outraged and concerned about human rights abuses around the world must be secretly motivated by anti-Jewish hatred, which is ridiculous. But fueling those kinds of ideas also fuels hostility towards Jewish people, because what the government is doing is essentially saying the only way to fight anti-Semitism is to be anti-human rights, is to crack down on our civil liberties. And that is also dangerous for Jews in this country, because we are likely to foot the blame for that. Every time the government says, we need to ban protests because we need to support the Jewish community, you're essentially putting a target on our backs.
Well, you know what? Let me actually unpack this with you, because as you're saying, Jewish voices have been at the forefront of a lot of these protests. And I guess we've seen this targeted attack against the participants, against the Jewish participants, in the sense of like being extremely dismissive. A lot of these Jewish participants are either being called brainwashed or naive. I think I heard a journalist use the term the other day, useful idiots. But it's extremely dismissive of the, I guess, the agency that a lot of these Jewish protesters have at these protests. So how do you react to that? How do you react to how this is being framed again in the media by those who are against the pro-Palestine protests?
I think for many people in political leadership or the political establishment and in the media, we have to be asking ourselves, what politics does it serve to say, this is what all Jewish people think? This is the monolithic Jewish opinion on these issues. And that is actually serving a politics of repression, and that the sort of blocking out of the diversity or plurality of Jewish feelings and experiences in this country is about using Jewish people in aid of their own repressive politics, or misusing Jewish people in aid of a repressive politics. We know from even the data released last year in October from the Jewish Policy Research Institute stated that 40% of Jewish people between 16 and 29 no longer identify as Zionists in this country. Like the Jewish community is politically diverse as much as there are attempts to make us monolithic, and that when you don't reflect that political reality, it really allows and shows how minorities, not just Jews, but many minorities in this country, are just used as political football for whatever the sort of intentions of the state are at that time. And I think the second thing I would say is that I do find it astounding that people cannot, or like the government or the media cannot understand how Jewish people are just like everyone else. And many Jewish people are really, really concerned and outraged about what Israel is doing, because they care about human beings and they care about human rights. And that this is very much, I don't see there's any contradiction or competition between my Jewish values and standing up for Palestine. I think it's part of my Jewish values is why I stand up for Palestine. And so to have this narrative and these ideas completely erased from the public discourse is very disappointing and very frustrating, frankly.
Well, let me get you to react to a clip as well, because another thing that's being missed from the conversation is that a far-right march led by Tommy Robinson is planned for the same day of that Nakba Day demonstration, which is May 16th. Let me play you this clip by the leader of the Conservatives, and we'll get back to your reaction.
Would you consider taking similar action against the march that's planned for the same day as the pro-Palestinian march, May the 16th, the rally being organised by Stephen Yaxley-Lennon, Tommy Robinson, a convicted far-right activist? Would you consider banning that
Well,
too?
is he creating a climate of intimidation and violence that is resulting in 2 people murdered in Heaton Park, 2 people nearly murdered in Golders Green? I'm not saying that we shouldn't have a right to protest. There is something specific that is happening at these marches that is different.
Now, how do you react to this, Em? Is there a double standard here?
Yeah, I mean, do I think that the far right have caused violence and murder in this country? Yes. But also, I think it really shows the way in which the political establishment, when these kinds of, understandably, like, when there is horrific crimes like this and these moments of crises, they take the opportunity to try and clamp down on civil liberties. And that, us understanding that anti-Semitism is rising and a serious concern, and, it does feel much scarier than it really has for the time I've lived in the UK, honestly. Like that, I do feel it. And I think a lot of people are. That doesn't mean that other forms of racism and racist violence should be dismissed or treated differently. I think that one of the things that happens in these moments is there's a desire to separate out the different threats that a lot of different minority communities are facing right now, whether that's asylum seekers or trans people or migrants or Muslim communities, of course. And actually, we need to be able to see these things as interconnected. The rise of extremist and far-right politics in this country is threatening all of us, particularly minority communities. And we need to be able to see these things as interconnected in order to address them effectively. It's very clear that the current systems are not working, and also even having said all this, we also know that the far right pose a huge threat to other communities, and wanting the government to take that seriously does not diminish my desire for them to also take anti-Semitism seriously. And I truly just find it astounding that the sort of double standards also that are, as you say, that are applied to pro-Palestine marches, when you literally have far-right marches of white nationalists in the streets chanting death to Islam, and are obviously overtly anti-Semitic as well. We know that anti-Semitism fuels the far-right. It's one of the biggest agitators. So yeah, it's very concerning to see how clearly many government officials or politicians just see this as an opportunity for political football and not actually care and serious care for and compassion for minority communities, including Jewish communities.
I'll end on this note because it's related to what you're saying, and I just have a few seconds left. But the big argument right now is that banning these marches is about keeping Jewish people and Jewish communities safe. Now, how do you respond to that?
I think that there is a lot we need to be doing in this country to address rising anti-Semitism as well as rising attacks on other minority communities. But banning these protests is not the way to go, and is also not morally justifiable. I think that it's very clear how quickly the government moved from what is an attack by an individual in Golders Green into this is the problem with the Palestine movement. And those leaps actually first of all, are morally unjust, but they also will only likely generate more animosity towards Jewish people, because we are seen as the justification for taking away civil liberties. And the government needs to stop using our real fear and pain and concern at this time to fuel their own anti-protest political agenda.
And we'll leave it here. Em Hilton, always a pleasure to speak to you. Thanks for coming on MEE Live. You. And for everyone watching, thanks for tuning in. Make sure you're following us on social media. That's at Middle East Eye. And you can also email us, meelive@middleeasteye.net. Now hit subscribe to stay on top of all of our coverage. That's on YouTube, of course. And we'll see you next time.